Victoria 3's war and combat system clearly presents combat at a grand scale. It's a simulation of the world, obviously. And whether it's a late game conflict or a mid game conflict like this one, or if we bounce right back to the start of the game with a cheeky early expansion as France, when I polled you, it was very clear 22,000 votes, warfare mechanics needing the most improvement above all other options, 61% of you responded. Furthermore, delving a little deeper, after they started to reveal how they might change the system, some 30,000 of you responded. Thanks, by the way. Really appreciate it. It's great for gathering data, even if it is just a YouTube poll. And again, it was war easily by far and away ahead of the other changes that they had signaled. So in this video, we're going to delve in. What's the deal with war in Victoria 3? And more specifically, how do the developers of Paradox Interactive plan to change it moving forward? What are the problems that they've identified? And how are they suggesting that they'll fix them? Let's take a look firstly at this quote, because this kind of sets the overarching design philosophy for Victoria 3's war system and gives us a reasonable idea about where it's moving. The key is actually in the middle here. I'm just going to quote it verbatim. While I believe that we have landed on a very solid core of how we want military gameplay in Victoria 3 to function, and we have no intention of moving back towards a more tactical system, it is a system that suffers from some interface woes, and which could do with selective deepening and increasing player control in specific areas. A few of the things we're looking into improving and expanding on for the military system follow here in no particular order. And of course, we're going to take a look at those bullet points very soon, just slightly later in the video. But the thing to take away here is that the Victoria 3 design philosophy is different from that which has come before it. Rightly or wrongly, they don't appear to be bowing to pressures to conform to Victoria 2 or Hearts of Iron 4. Take your pick. There are a lot of different takes on how combat could play out in a grand strategy game, but it's clear here, again, rightly or wrongly, that they intend to forge their own path and keep the military, combat, and warfare system in Victoria 3, if you don't already know, within this system that I'm experimenting with right now on screen, the diplomatic plays system. Military, of course, being one arm inside of this economic and political simulator. With that out of the way, then, let's take a look at the specifics and when and how they intend to approach them. In the most recent developer's diary from literally yesterday at the time of recording, they clarified this. They said that patch 1.1, the next patch, is actually going to focus on things like game polish, on bug fixing, on balancing, AI improvements, and user interface work. That patch 1.1, is expected to release before the end of this year. And when we consider that there'll be a holiday period, shutdown, etc., in late December, we're probably looking at that around 4 weeks from now, give or take 2 weeks either side. The military patch then is not to follow until next year, in what will be patch 1.2. That is, to some players, a little disappointing. Others acknowledge that it's probably a reasonable thing to expect. The game's just came out, and many of you have also highlighted performance as being a significant challenge, particularly as you move through to the late game. Maybe you have some of those grand conflicts like my one that I demonstrated at the start. We might bounce back to some footage of that later on. And I agree. I think that those performance, polish, and stabilization issues should be addressed first. So then, what are the specific military ones? Once we've got that tidying up and housekeeping out the road. Well, in a nutshell, it's these 6 points. The first is about addressing rough edges with how the generals function. These 3 chaps on the right of my screen at the moment that are commanding my entire army of battalions and conscripts, who of course I don't control individually. I just set the general's orders and they do the rest. Here Paradox is suggesting that they'll improve unit selection for battles and balance the overall progression along front lines. They also hint later there in those final bullet points that they'd like to experiment with giving us a bit more control about frontline splitting on longer fronts. This front that I'm fighting on at the moment with Belgium, not very big. But in other games, you will absolutely see some monstrous front lines if you're playing maybe as Russia or the Great Qing, something like that. The middle points here are more about strategic objectives. They want to give us the ability to set objectives for generals. One general may be given an objective to pincer in, while others, maybe we see more variants of defensive positions. They also go on to say that they'd like to increase the visibility of navies and make admirals easier to work with. I fiddle around a little bit in this gameplay trying to get the naval invasions to work, and actually, you know what? It successfully works, and it probably could be responsible for turning the tide in many fights in Victoria 3. Naval invasions are one of the ways that we do have a bit more agency and control over the fight, because of course, unlike land-based battles, with the naval invasions you can stretch in, flank the enemy, and it does feel a little more strategic because we have a little bit more control. That is, of course, fundamentally one of the arguments behind Victoria 3's war system being lacking. And I agree that more control could be useful. So what are the other controls that they're offering? They largely focus on either fixing existing issues or providing a bit more control around front lines. As far as existing issues go, of course, it's things like trying to provide a little bit more stability or information to the player, extra data, underlying numbers from battles to help them understand it a bit more. The data that they present already, as you'll notice throughout this whole campaign in this video, is actually fairly decent in seeing how the battle played out. Although you could argue it doesn't really give us much at the start. We don't know how we can use that to inform decisions moving forward. The other thing specifically on front lines was finding solutions to where those multiple fronts could split up. Maybe we might even see increased player agency there. However, I think that the other thing to remember is that military doesn't operate in isolation. As I mentioned at the start of the video, I think it would be a shame to just focus on adding extra front lines and that kind of thing. And thankfully, it seems like Paradox, of course, believes the same. Absolutely they would. And if you delve into some of the other sections that they've talked about, like this one on screen, the diplomacy section and how they intend to change the diplomatic play system, I think you'll start to get that idea. Let's take a look. These 3 points are some great examples. Outside of the military reforms, they're also reforming the diplomatic play system. Firstly, options like reverse swaying, the ability to offer to join another side in a play in exchange for something else. Hey mate, I'll help you fight if you give me your Cuba or whatever. Secondly, the ability to expand your primary demands in a diplomatic play beyond just one. This is very important if the AI decides to back down. I've talked about this a little bit already on the channel, so I won't dwell on it. But if you're unfamiliar, when you press a war goal, like I did here, primary war goal to take a province, and the AI decides, actually, we don't want to fight you, you can just keep it, you can't push more demands. So if you were trying to take 5 provinces, you'll only get your first one because that was the only quote-unquote primary demand. This is an important thing to fix because it kind of sets up the whole theatre of war. And lastly, of course, we need more options outside of just brute force combat. The final point here is that more things to offer in diplomatic plays will be enabled, including the ability to give away land, which is another big deal here, right? Because one of the reasons, if not the primary reason, why you might choose to go to war is to capture more land. People, resources, buildings, whatever that resides within it. And if you have another way to do that, then that also indirectly improves Victoria 3's military system. And I know what you're going to say, well, you can't just improve a system by giving me options to not use it, and I agree, but it's more about viewing it as a big picture here. The military in combat doesn't need to be the only solution to these land border disputes. And I would argue that by giving us more agency as players on how we can achieve that, on how we can reach our goals of colonizing Spain as France, or whatever it may be, that will ultimately serve to provide a better military system as well. So then when, where, and how much will it cost me are some of the questions that arise next, and I think rightly so. The when is a little tricky to pin down. We know that they're continuing with hotfixes 1.0.6, as you can see, being the next one that will help include some late game performance improvements and other fixes, and they're aiming to release that very soon. We know, of course, that patch 1.1, that wider improvement looking at to sort of stabilize, polish, and fix some of the UI in the game, will come out before the end of the year, which leaves these improvements, these gameplay feature-based improvements, scheduled for, of course, 2023. Sounds like a long way away, but it's November, so, you know, this year has flown by. That aside, though, I think that it's important that we also acknowledge in the very first update after the game released, they said that these changes would come through for free. Free changes to the base game. There was, of course, a lot of speculation that future DLC, maybe even a reformed war system, would be put behind a paywall. And that could very well still happen in years to come. But what we know for now, aside from all of the speculation and just focusing on the evidence and data that we have, is that the changes that I've discussed in this video will be coming in a free patch sometime next year, 2023. And they'll focus on that performance stability fixes for the remainder of this year. So, with Victoria 3's warfare and conflict future laid out, at least at a high level for us over the next maybe 3 to 6 months, what do you think? What do you think about the direction that they're taking, the way that they're prioritizing the changes? And do you think that they will make a difference to conflict and warfare in Victoria 3? I believe they will, and while I don't personally have a hill to die on over the current system, I actually don't really mind it all that much, I think there are definitely improvements to be made, and until we get our hands on them and can judge them properly, I remain fairly optimistic. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.